Hi, I'm Chris Swift. I am currently Director of Chaplaincy and Spirituality at Methodist Homes, and before that for 20 years I was a chaplain in the NHS, most of which was spent in the Leeds teaching hospitals. And I want to just say a little bit today about spiritual and pastoral care for people who are bereaved and for people who seek support from churches and from pastoral care workers. I think the main advice I would give based on experience would be compassion with truthfulness. And that sometimes is reflected in the language we choose. There can be all kinds of ways we avoid using the word death or dead, and whilst it's not a term that should be laboured, it's equally important at times to simply use the accurate words to describe the situation and the experience that somebody is facing. Reticence about doing that might actually be a lot more to do with us than it is to do with the person who is bereaved. I also believe, based on particularly my experience in the NHS, that there is a great need to be able to witness in that truthful and compassionate way the circumstances that are before you. And sometimes the way in which somebody has died will be quite traumatic, and it may have caused exceptional and unusual anxiety by those who are bereaved. And from a theological point of view, and from a position of Christian spirituality, I would not want to look away from that reality or those circumstances. So sometimes I would be called into a critical situation in the NHS, for example, the death of somebody who is younger, or indeed a baby, or the loss of a baby. And at those times it felt to me it was so important to represent and to model, if you like, a God who doesn't look away. There may not be the magical solution that somebody would want in those circumstances. We can't give them the thing that they want most, which is for that younger person to continue to be alive with us. But the very, very least we can do is not shy away from that. And it seems to me that people value and need an understanding or an interaction, perhaps to say, more accurately, an interaction based on somebody who is willing to stand beside them and to behold what they are beholding and to witness that experience in their lives. And when that has happened within my time with the NHS, it has been so fruitful later at the funeral. If I've been asked to be involved or to take the funeral, to be the same person who was at that critical moment of loss has been invaluable. I know that most of the time that isn't possible for ministers who are involved in supporting bereaved people, but nevertheless I did see where it can and does happen. It can make a huge difference. So for example, in the circumstances of the loss, the death of a baby, taking the funeral, and I can remember the grandmother of that child, the mother of the mother, saying, you know, we couldn't be with them at that critical time. It was so sudden, but it was so pleasing to know that they weren't alone, that there was somebody there with them, attending to their spiritual needs, present, not necessarily saying too much. There is a real importance in valuing and cherishing silence, I think, within pastoral care. Not oppressive or distant, but a silent attention and presence. And just to finish, one of the key texts, I suppose, biblically that I draw on for that experience and for that insight is the beginning of the book of Job. And you will remember perhaps that Job, in the devastation that his life and all those multiple losses that he was experiencing, he did have three friends. Friends might seem a misnomer maybe, and indeed comforters, because in the rest of Job it's not always comfort that they seem to bring. But at the start, in the early part of that book, the friends hear about the suffering of Job. So the first thing that happens is they don't just sit there and say, oh, Job will give us a ring, we'll get a carrier pigeon or whatever else it might be, when Job decides he needs some help. They decide together to go and find him. They seek out Job. And Job sees them or meets them whilst they're on that journey. He's not in the place where he lived, but he's on the road, and the friends meet him. And it says that they then mirrored and reflected in their own embodiment, in their physical presence, the posture and the position that Job was in. He was on the ground, his clothes were torn, he was distraught. And so the Bible tells us that they too got on the ground with him, and they expressed their lament and their sorrow in a similar way into which he was physically cast at that moment. But the key thing is, it then says they sat there with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and they didn't say a word. They were in silence because they saw his suffering was so great. He was not alone, but people didn't rush to him, his friends, full of words, full of wisdom, cliches, whatever, proverbs. They simply didn't say anything because they saw that his suffering was so great. And sometimes our words cannot grapple or engage or represent the suffering that somebody is experiencing in bereavement. And at those times, being silent, but being present, being attentive, and not shying away is the right thing to do, and brings unspoken solace and comfort to those who are distressed.